So welcome back to Study Chess with me, and in this video we'll be pursuing the chapter on passed pawns, special passed pawns, in this particular case, blockaded passed pawns, in the book by Ludik Pachman, The Complete Chess Strategy, Volume 2. And we are here in front of a position which he set up. It had no kings. And the idea is to illustrate basically what he is going to be demonstrating in the next example games. And what he has to say about it is this. The strength of a protected passed pawn can be sapped if it is blockaded, if possible by a knight, as here, and an attack is mounted against the pawn guarding it, or pawns. In this setup, black will aim for pressure on white's d-pawn by means of a6 and b5. So a6 followed by b5, attacking, of course, c4. And above all, with f5. Because in this particular position, presuming equal material, black can attack it without worrying about a defense with f3. Okay. Our next game illustrates some problems arising from protected passed pawns. We see how white's d-pawn is first blockaded and then converted into a weak isolated pawn, whereas black's c-pawn brings about the decision by advancing at the right moment. Okay. So he makes a few comments about the opening, and it really goes all the way to move 14. So we'll just skip ahead. The players here are Christoffel versus Boleslavsky, Groningen, 1946. Now, Christoffel, I don't know who he is, but Boleslavsky, of course, is a very famous grandmaster who peaked really in the mid-50s. And according to Chessmetrics by Jeff Sonas, who calculates ratings of players before ELO ratings were really a thing, very exhaustively, it needs to be pointed out. According to him, Boleslavsky peaked in the top 3 or 4 players in the world for a few years. He didn't last long at that particular height, but for a while he was absolutely a major force to be reckoned with. He's also a famous theoretician. There is the Boleslavsky variant in the King's Indian. And these kinds of positions with these blockaded pawns in the centers with c4, d5, and e4, which are actually very characteristic of some of the mainline King's Indians, would really suit him quite well. Okay, so sorry about that. d4, c4, g6, and sure enough, we have a King's Indian. d6, and f3, knight bd7. Okay, so we're not going to be seeing the main line, knight c6, etc., or e5 first. e5. Well, it needs to be said that, yes, Boleslavsky is going to win this game. That's a gimme. But black in this particular position has to be much worse, because white is already gaining all the space, has already his hooks in place, and yeah, it's say what you like, but white is to be preferred here. g3, h6, knight h4. Okay, so the first comment by Ludik Pachman. It was precisely this plan chosen here by white with knight h4, which drove black's opening system out of fashion. White prevents the freeing f5 and prepares to exploit his active position on the queen side. So Black responded with knight df6. I'm just looking to see if he really managed to prevent f5 as he claims. Yes, obviously, immediately there's if f5, knight takes g6. That's okay. I can see that. That's not the problem. The problem is, what if black plays something like king h7 and prepares it? Is that completely impossible? Okay, so knight df6, b takes c5. And he points out that the immediate bishop e3 would be impossible because of knight g4. Fair enough. He does not approve of b takes c5. He actually puts a question mark to it. It is not easy to resist such a tempting opportunity to create a passed pawn. Nevertheless, this move is unfavorable here, as black is ready to blockade the pawn immediately with a knight and thereby improve immensely the coordination of his pieces. That may be true, but that doesn't necessarily mean it's bad. And he doesn't propose an alternative. Now, there's no question that the knight will be on a dream spot on d6. No arguments there. And we're going to see it very soon, obviously. But he makes it sound as if suddenly black was doing fine. I don't see it that way. Black is still hampered, has less space, is underdeveloped, and has a more difficult development. Okay, well, d takes c5, a4, a5. And Pachman has a comment here. He says, otherwise, after a5 by white, followed by bishop e3, black's c-pawn would be constantly difficult to protect. White has thus achieved a certain success, as he has cut out black's possibility of counterplay on the queen side. However, white's a-pawn turns out to be tactically weak, so it is not possible to pass a definitive judgment on 16, this is the 16th move, a4, played by white. Rook b1, knight d6. Okay, got his dream blockader in place. A typical position in which the protected passed pawn offers no real advantage. Yet. It is well blockaded by the knight, no arguments, and black can eventually carry out the counter thrust f5. Bishop a3, and he gives this a question mark. He says this is a developing move of doubtful value. White is tempted by tactical sorry. White is tempted by tactical threats down the b file, but these in no way compensate for the strategically poor posting of his bishop on a3. Well, honestly, it has to be said that bishop a3 looks incredibly superficial because, yeah, if you don't have any, if you're not putting any real permanent pressure on c5, and you don't have any, obviously, let's say, powerful threat to justify it, then what the heck is it doing on a3? I mean, it would be so much better on a diagonal such as e3. Yeah, you can prepare it. You don't have to worry about knight g4 permanently. You can play f3 first or h3, whichever is more desirable, and then play bishop e3, and then you still have c5 attacked, and keep it on a much more attractive diagonal. Yeah, it looks like a Patzer move, frankly. Of course, I'm not strong enough to be playing in Groningen 1946. And I can't comment about Christoffel, but it just looks really superficial. Be that as it may. b6, queen b3, rook a6, obviously sidestepping the obvious tactic of rook b8, bishop takes c5, which was, of course, the whole idea of bishop a3, but a player of Boleslavsky's caliber will see that instantly. So rook a6. Now you might say, well, the rook is really poorly placed on a6, and that's certainly true. It's not going to be doing much immediately anyway, regardless of where we place it, because it's not going to be like going to e8 or something and helping push f5 just yet. And, well, black will be able to reposition his pieces to be able to free up that rook for better purposes. Knight d7, maybe. Now, why not knight d7 immediately? Queen c2, because he wants to play knight h7. Gotcha. Knight b5, exclamation point by Pachman. Okay, an idea which is well known to us from the previous section on the blockade of passed pawns. So see the previous video. The move also has an interesting tactical point because knight takes knight would be countered by c takes b5, rook a7, knight f3, with the idea of knight d2 and knight c4, achieving a dream blockading square of his own. And black will be hard-pressed to position something of equal appeal on d6. I mean, the knight is already back on h7, so. Okay, but of course he didn't fall for that. So knight h7, knight b5, congratulations, exclamation point. Knight g5, exclamation point. Right back at you. King h1. King h1. To do what? Avoid check? Wow. Basically, you're just doing what you would get if you had an actual check, and honestly, check isn't a big deal. Is his plan knight g2 then? I mean, I'm trying to understand the whole idea of king h1. I have to assume that even though I've been less than admiring by a couple of White's plays, he's also played some really nice moves. The only thing that I can see that would explain the idea of king h1 is this. Imagine he wants to play knight g2 with the idea of f4. I mean, White has to do something. He can't just sit there holding pieces all the way there and waiting for Black to resign of his own volition. As a result, he would be trying to free himself or get a hook with something like f4. And knight g2 would be a good way to achieve that. But of course, if you do that, you run into knight f3. And of course, you have a certain exchange here. I'm not saying that's the idea, and Pachman doesn't make any comment here, but it's, or does he? Wait, he says something here. Okay, so Black's last move has so changed the tactical situation that he can now profitably exchange knights on b5. So b5 takes d6 was essential. But he doesn't try to explain the idea of king h1 at all. I mean, sure, I won't argue that knight takes d6 was the better move. But I'm trying to understand what Christoffel had in mind at all. And that's the idea that I can perceive. If there's something else, I'm blind to it. Fair enough. So instead, Black is the one who plays knight takes b5. C takes b5. Rook a7. And now, of course, we have the b file that's blockaded, so the rook is free to leave. And with the knight on g5, that previous, let's say, idea of White's to play knight f3, knight d2, knight c4 is no longer doable, because if knight f3, then we'll just exchange it with knight takes f3. So now White's knight can no longer reach c4 in time, as f3 is guarded. And knight g2, aiming for the same idea of hitting c4 but via a different route, allows knight f3. When Black obtains an overwhelming positional superiority with f5 to follow. Okay. So the idea, of course, was still knight g2. And he's saying now, I'm assuming, that the real idea is, of course, still to avoid knight f3, but not to prepare f4, but rather to still reposition his knight to c4, but via g2, e3, and then c4. Fair enough. Yes, it doesn't work, but a noteworthy idea and something to keep for the future. So bishop b2, queen d6. As we have already mentioned, the queen is usually a very poor blockader, but every rule has its exception. The queen is actually well placed here, as it not only blockades the d-pawn, but it also protects black's e5 pawn and b6 pawn. No. And g pawn, I see. So if he plays f5, then g6 will actually be protected by the queen. Okay. And thus helps to prepare, of course, the vital f5. Queen d2, rook e7, bishop g2, bishop h3. Exclamation point. This exchange of bishops favors black, as it increases the power of the f5 push to come by removing one of white's controls of e4 and d5. So the bishop will actually no longer be able to support this when f5 comes. Bishop takes h3. Not a lot of choices anyway. Knight takes, knight g2, knight g5. White was threatening both f4 and knight e3, followed by knight c4. Fair enough. Queen d1. And this prevents the threatened win of the exchange, and finally hoping to play his knight to knight c4 with the idea of knight e3, and if knight takes e4, knight c4. That's the idea in any case. However, black has meanwhile prepared the decisive breakthrough and is one step ahead. f5. Finally. G takes f5. E takes f5, sorry. G takes f5. So in this position, we can see how surprisingly the situation has changed since move 17. I'll just quickly put back 17 so you can see this. This is move 17. And you can see the d-pawn strongly protected by c4 and e4. And here we are back, and suddenly the pawn is all by his lonesome. Both supports of white's d-pawn have disappeared, and this pawn has suddenly become quite weak. In contrast, black's c-pawn is very strong, and its advance will bring about the final decision. It is important to note that white cannot carry out his intention of playing his knights to the strategically important c4 square, because after knight e3, f4, knight c4, queen d7, queen d7, black would have a winning attack on the king side. Not queen g6? Looks like such a natural square. You're leaving d6 anyway. Oh, f4. So this prevents f4 by black, but gives black's knight an excellent post on e4. So, knight e4. King g1. Hastening his defeat, white would put up a longer fight after rook f1 instead. Obviously, the threat is knight f2 check. But instead of king g1, rook f1 would have been a much more interesting alternative. So, king g1, c4. Here she comes. F takes c5, bishop takes c5, bishop takes, rook takes. And now both rook takes d5 and knight c3 is threatened. White could actually resign already, but plays on a little longer. So knight e3, knight c3, queen d4, knight takes b1, rook takes, rook e4, knight takes f5, rook takes d4, rook takes d6, c3, nice. Rook takes d5, knight e4, rook c8. And more material will fall. Because after knight e2, is game over. Well, it was already game over, but it was even more game over. Okay. So, connected passed pawns are usually so strong that sacrifices are often made in order to create them. It is not easy to blockade them, and as they can often support each other as they move forward together, it is interesting to note that we frequently see a fight between a minor piece and three connected pawns. In an endgame, the pawns are a little stronger than the knight or bishop, if backed up by the king. Alone, the pawns, yeah, not unless they're already pretty well advanced. But the situation in the middle game is much more complex, as the extra piece can be used in the attack before the pawns become dangerous. However, after the exchange of queens, the value of the pawns increase, as the following game will show. Bronstein versus Najdorf. So the game doesn't give much information other than to say it's between Argentina and the Soviet Union in 1954, and it takes place in Buenos Aires. This is not the candidates tournament. Because it wasn't a nation's event. And I don't know if the Olympiad took place in Buenos Aires in 1954, but I'll assume that's the case. Regardless, Bronstein in 1954 had to be the big favorite because he had already been challenger against Botvinnik for the world title in 1950, in which he was unsuccessful in his bid, but it was a long and very close match. And he was going to be doing this again. So, yeah, Bronstein was the man in 1954, other than Botvinnik, of course. But Najdorf, of course, was a very famous and very strong grandmaster. He is from Poland initially, and emigrated to Argentina at around this time. So we'll skip ahead to the key position, which is move 14. And surprise, surprise, or not so surprise, we have a Sicilian Najdorf by Najdorf. Bishop g5, e6, queen f3. Knight bd7, castle, b7, bg3, b5. Ooh. Okay. Okay, so here we have the first lengthy comment. Let us consider Bronstein's assessment of this position. White has won 3 pawns for his piece, an approximate material equivalent, but it would be wrong to judge this position merely from a material point of view. While it is relatively easy for white to restrict the activity of the black knight, it is much more difficult for black to battle against white's passed pawns. In this game, black by no means exploited the possibilities at his disposal. h6 exclamation point, bishop d2. So Pachman says that bishop takes f6 deserved an exclamation point. In contradiction to Bronstein, who wrote about this position and this particular move, as in the given position, the black squared bishop on g5 is extremely strong. It would be a pity to give it up for the rook, never mind a knight. And Pachman thinks he was overestimating the importance of this bishop, and references a full game in the notation between Fichtel and Dolezal from the Czechoslovak championship. And Pachman is Czech, by the way, in which white won. I will not repeat the entire game, but apparently this is the source of his comment. I've played these kinds of positions more than once, and I won't claim any grandmaster expertise on it, but I'm quite familiar with the tribulations of it, and I don't think it makes that big of a difference. So, bishop d2, bishop b7, f3, castle. And Pachman comments, the decisive mistake. He had to castle on the queen's side when his king can play a vital part in the fight against the passed pawns, while he can carry out sharp counterattack on the king's side via g4, g5. Prospects are probably about even in the complex position that arises, but it is clear that white's 15th move, the bishop d2 he's talking about, has cost him an important tempo, allowing black to complete his development by castling long. And he thinks that black should have castled long instead. Why? Well, I'll pipe in my very modest opinion and voice here, but I don't agree with either of the choices. I mean, yeah, I agree that short castle looks really bad, because the last thing you want to be doing is removing your king all the way to the king's side for no good reason, when he should be trying to support the black pieces against the phalanx of white pawns. But I don't think long castle is a solution either. There's no need for either. Unless I'm mistaken, he can just play king e7. I mean, long castle. So what? Why is this so special? The king on h8, I mean, the rook on h8 isn't really going to be able to come in any faster because of this. Yeah, the king is closer to the pawns, and that's good. But the rook wasn't badly placed on a8 at all, because it helps the fight against the white pawns. So, I mean, my immediate gut move, unless there's a refutation for it, would be king e7. then you can bring in the rooks here or whatever. And your king is well placed in the center. There's no attack. Even to get a tempo against an extra tempo against the rook on d6. Well, Pachman doesn't mention it. I don't really know why. I mean, it looks like a completely natural looking move. Okay, whatever. So, castle. Yeah, I agree with Pachman that that doesn't look like a great move. b3, rook f8, king b2, knight c5, bishop e3, e5, rook hd1, knight e6, rook b6, bishop c6, knight d5, exclamation point. Bishop takes d5, e takes d5. We have a comment here. White now has 4 connected pawns, and the outcome is already clear. Yeah, I got nothing to say. Knight c5, rook b5, knight d7, c4. Oof. Yeah, this is going to go bad really fast. e4, bishop takes c5, knight takes c5, f takes c4, knight takes c4. And I missed a comment by Pachman here. After bishop takes c5, he points out, white finally exchanges his bishop for the knight, since the 2 knights would otherwise make it difficult to advance the pawns. As it is, white plans to sacrifice a pawn to give him time to advance the others. He means the e-pawn to allow the 4 white pawns to start rolling forward. Okay. d6. This is already dead. Rook takes a2, king takes a2, knight c3 check, king a3. Oh, this was the pawn that he was talking about. Fair enough. I wonder if this is desperation. I mean, there's no way he can believe that that knight on d1 is going to contribute to stopping those white pawns. Well, he played c5 here, and I got distracted here trying to analyze the consequences of d7 straight out with rook d5. But yeah, it doesn't matter. Knight c3, rook a5, knight d5, c6. Attacking, of course, the knight on d5. Knight f6, rook a6. This is completely gone. King f8, b4, king e8, b5, knight d7, rook a7, rook b8, rook takes d7, rook takes b5, rook a7, rook b8, d7. Yeah. Okay. Quite the rout by the great Bronstein, and not a great showing by Najdorf. Najdorf was a brilliant player, and not just famous for his innovative ideas in the Sicilian, he was truly a world-class player, top 10. I don't know what his ranking is according to Chessmetrics, but he was certainly a top 10 player in his peak. Interestingly enough, he wasn't a full-time professional. In spite of having played at such a high level, he actually, I recall reading that he started an insurance company when he was in Argentina and became a millionaire as a result. And he was fully committed to his business. That he managed to continue to play chess at such an extraordinary standard says a lot about just how brilliant a man he was. In any case, this will wrap up the video today on Ludik Pachmann's work, and we will continue it soon enough. The next video will be on the exercises of Dvoretsky in, oh yes, corresponding squares. I'm a little bit nervous about that one. I did the lesson in the last video, and it looked really comprehensible, but I'm still worried that I didn't get the whole idea. Well, we'll find out soon enough, won't we? In any case, thank you for joining me. Happy chess and good mates.